The Middle St. Croix is a little bit unique in the metro area because we have not only state organizations, but we have quite a few federal organizations that overlay jurisdiction because of the federal designation of the St. Croix River, and then as well as the large river with the Corps of Engineers. The Middle St. Croix is actually made up of 10 communities, and so we're really a local unit of government, and I'm an extension of the city staff of these 10 different communities, and we work collaboratively to manage stormwater resources within the WMO. And this has been a really efficient So I fill that role working side by side with the staff in the communities. The Watershed Management Organization is really legally founded through a joint powers agreement between the 10 member communities. An elected official from each community, either a council member or the mayor, is appointed to be a member for our board, and our board meets monthly to conduct the business of the Watershed Management Organization. So as a watershed, we do have performance standards for things like wetland buffers, stormwater management, erosion and sediment control, etc. But those standards are actually implemented through the authority of the communities. Our watershed does not have a permit program, but we do provide technical review for all projects submitted within the communities that trigger our review for the watershed standards. So that's just a real brief snapshot of how John and I work together. John is an engineer for a number of communities in the Middle St. Croix, and I'm an extension of their staff as well. So what I want to do real quick is just give a quick perspective from a watershed perspective on the evolution of stormwater management over the last 15 or 20 years. It really kind of starts with the simple graphic that I know you've all seen over and over again. As we increase impervious surface, we're really changing the hydrologic regime in the urban landscape, and we know that we're decreasing groundwater recharge, as well as decreasing superficial groundwater, which is important because we see that superficial groundwater decrease reflected in the inner storm elevations in our creeks, streams, and urban lakes. But then the big change really is this enormous increase in our surface water runoff, which is why in the 70s and 80s, the world of urban stormwater management really took on a focus of conveyance and storage, managing those flood events. But along with that large volume of water, we're also getting a lot of pollutants, primarily nitrogen, phosphorus, right? Hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and bacteria are the big ones, as well as sediment, which a lot of those are bound to. So in Minnesota, the big deal for us is phosphorus. It's one of the leading pollutants that's impairing our surface waters. In the 1980s, the University of Minnesota did a study and showed that 1 pound of phosphorus it generates at least 500 pounds of algae. The study actually found that it varied based on the ecology of the lake, and it was anywhere from 500 to 1,100 pounds of algae in the lake. So this was a big driver behind Minnesota banning phosphorus in fertilizers that are applied on lawns, for example. So state laws, you can only apply phosphorus fertilizer to bare soil to decrease the concentrations in our urban stormwater runoff. That was really an effective law and is still in place and adhered to a little bit better every year. We're making progress on that. But really the big driver is that we knew at that point that we had to kind of we had to keep doing what we're doing for stormwater management, keep safely conveying water and providing a stable flow paths, keep providing storage for flood events and rate control. But the data across the nation was showing that we were missing a component in our stormwater management. We were seeing it locally, but it really, through the 1990s and 2000s, all of that data was really consolidated by the National Academies of Sciences in 2008, where their report on urban stormwater management in the United States demonstrated, the science showed that our past practices have been ineffective at protecting water quality. So we were doing a much better job, and I think we can anecdotally see that in our communities, but we were doing a much better job at flood control, so we don't see the occurrence of floods as frequently as we did in the 70s, except when we get 10 inches of rain, of course. But we still weren't doing a good enough job based on the science of protecting water quality and having recreational waters in our urban areas. We saw that locally as well. So in the Middle St. Croix, we have a number of TMDLs and impairments. And so concurrent with this, what we discovered through that science is that it was really the small storms in Minnesota that were generating the majority of our pollutant load. So for us, between that half-inch and 1.5-inch storm event, generates 75% of our annual pollutant load, which is impacting the quality of our recreational waters. So the National Academy of Sciences really kind of picked up on all of the work that had been done in Prince George's County, Maryland, and the Center for Watershed Protection, kind of generating the science and data behind small storm control through infiltration, evapotranspiration, and harvesting, and really kind of put that together in the report and recommended that the evolution of stormwater for protecting water quality had to include these types of practices for small storms. So really what that meant for the Middle St. Croix Watershed Management Organization, we have a portion of our watershed has a lot of well-draining A soils, really sandy soils. So we can do a lot of good work just simply disconnecting impervious surfaces in areas where we don't have high density development. Kind of lower, we have quite a bit of low density large lot development. And then also by incorporating infiltration practices on top of our conveyance and our storage system. And to help move that along, in 2012, they finished the Lake St. Croix TMDL, the total maximum daily load, and the Middle St. Croix Watershed Management Organization's portion of that was approximately 1,500 pounds. And so the work that we had done starting in 2006 had been accumulating, and we're working towards that 1,500 pound load reduction with each practice that we put in. All right. With that, I think I'll turn it over to John because his worldview is a little bit different working on the city staff level.
Thanks, Mike. So as I get started here, you'll notice I put, well, let me just say this. So as was during the introduction earlier, it was mentioned that I'm with a consultant company named SEH. We're based on the Twin Cities. We have about 30 offices around the region. We do have one here in the Des Moines area. I titled my part of this presentation, A Perspective on the Evolution of Stormwater Management Regulations. I hope you don't mind that I phrased it that way because I knew I might be in a room with other engineers who have different perspective, different experiences. Every city is going to be a little different. Every county is a little different. Whatever your organization is. I also knew I was going to be in a room potentially with some administrators and some planners who deal with regulations and things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about regulations today from my experience and from in particular the last 15 years of serving some pretty small cities. So what I share with you today is based on this experience over the last few years. It may or may not be a perfect fit, but I'm hoping we'll all be able to maybe learn a little something from the experience, and I'm hoping to learn a little something from hearing back from you at the end of the day today here too. Again, just by way of introduction, we did this once already, so I won't dwell on this at all, but Brad Wozniak is one of our stormwater or water resource specialists. I'm a consulting city engineer, so really I have to joke with my family a lot that I sometimes feel like I'm the epitome of that phrase that says, jack of all trades and master of none. I don't know if the rest of you city engineers feel that way some days. Some of you have a very technical, specialized background, and so maybe you don't fit into that stereotype quite the way I do. But I started out doing a lot of subdivision, developer type design early in my career, and I moved to SEH where I was doing more infrastructure and street utility type projects, and was feeling pretty good about some of the expertise I developed over that time. And then I transitioned to the city engineer role, which was great and brought a lot of new challenges and new perspectives, and and things, but it really started to distance. I felt like I was starting to create a little distance between me and some of that technical expertise. So some of you folks, I apologize, you technical folks, if I say something that's a little out of date or here and there. I'm really intending to share what my experience has been over the last few years on some things that have worked well. In particular, it's correlated quite nicely with my introduction to working with Mike's organization and his predecessors about 14 years ago. So we'll, and I was going to mention though that, as you can see, Brad has a lot more little letters after his name than I do. And so what that really means is he's registered in more states than our attorneys lately have been. Do we have other consultants in the room? One or two, maybe? So our attorneys lately have been telling us that it's really important that when we put PE after our name, that we carefully indicate which states that belongs to. So I'm not actually licensed here in Iowa, so I have to make sure that I'm communicating, but Brad is, as you can see, and he's got professional hydrologist and certified floodplain manager. He's a really smart guy. So if we come to some questions that get detailed in nature, you may see me slump back in my chair and look to Brad for some help. So I serve as consulting city engineer for 4 of the cities that are in the Middle St. Croix WMO. In fact, all the cities that I serve are in the Middle St. Croix WMO, with the exception of some of the work I do for the city of Hudson in Wisconsin on the other side of the river. These 4 communities may be unique to what's represented here in the room and may not, I'm not sure. But I got the impression that some of the communities here are larger than what I serve. And I'll give you an idea. Bayport has a population, I think, of somewhere around 3,000 people. But if you take the prison population out, it's only 2,000. So they like to caveat their population a little bit by saying those aren't us. You know, the 1,600 or whatever that reside in the prison don't really reflect the rest of the community. Lakeland Shores and St. Mary's Point are both communities of about 300 people. So, but all of these communities are on the St. Croix River. All of these communities have really had to change how they manage stormwater over the past 10 or 15 years, and it's been a lot of work. Not so much from the standpoint of the physical on-the-ground improvements, although that comes with this, but there's a mindset amongst some of the elected officials in these communities, and I don't know if any of you will be able to relate to this or not, but elected officials can be a tricky bunch, and especially with small communities where they feel like we're coming into their backyard and telling them how to manage something, and that can be not well received if we're not careful about how we present the message. And I think that there is some, there's some of those lessons learned that can apply to regardless of the size of your community, because I think elected officials come with well, like we all do in this room here today, come with all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences and values and things that we bring to the jobs that we do every day. So where I'm from, we have stormwater regulations that come from a variety of places. And Mike asked me to kind of cover the evolution of our stormwater regs from a city engineer's perspective. And these are the 5 big buckets, if you will, the state. We have something called the Metropolitan Council. You guys have here in Des Moines area a council or some kind of regional planning group? And you do? Okay. And so ours is called the Metropolitan Council. We have our counties, our watershed districts, our watershed management organizations, and then municipalities. And within those groups, I would say for me, for the city engineer, while all apply, the bottom 2 are the ones that really affect my day-to-day the most, is the watershed management and the watershed district and the municipality. It isn't to say that we don't have to concern ourselves with the others, we certainly do, but it's these bottom 2 that affect sort of our bottom line design, what we require out of applicants when they come into projects and that sort of thing. So watershed management, I was going to touch briefly on this, I don't need to dwell on it, but I mentioned that, do you have watershed districts here? Do you have watershed management organizations? And in Minnesota, they're different statutorily, they have different authorizations. The biggest difference is the watershed district has its own levy powers and permitting powers. Watershed management organizations are, well, I'll borrow a term from your group here, they're sort of a collaborative of sorts, but they're communities coming together, agreeing to manage within their watershed together. And so they don't have, this in particular, the Middle St. Croix WMO doesn't issue permits per se, but they have performance standards. And then the local government agency, the city, the member communities, all are required to adopt the performance standards and the plans put out by the WMO and implement. So it's a little different way of navigating, but getting at the same end results. And in a couple of the cities that I work for, we have watershed district in part of it and WMO in the other part. So there's a variety of these things that we're juggling. And they do these things through their agreement through a joint powers agreement, which Mike had mentioned earlier. In the Middle St. Croix WMO, Mike, you'll correct me if I think you've looked through some of these, but
Yeah.
if I've got any of these dates wrong. Middle St. Croix developed its first generation watershed management plan in 2006. And when it first came out, a lot of the elected officials in the communities that I serve said, hey, wait a minute, we don't need another layer of government telling us how to develop or redevelop property. And there was a variety of standards and things that were in there that were perhaps different than what we had in our local codes. And since these were standards and not regulations, and there wasn't really a permit, certain communities sort of didn't really, I want to say, didn't take them as seriously as they really should be. Some of the action that they took along the way to adopt the watershed management plan and things like that might have been done by earlier councils, and so the new council didn't really understand that they were supposed to be implementing them. And so anyway, there was a little bit of a disconnect, I think, with that first generation plan. If I remember correctly, Mike, about 2013 or 14, the Middle St. Croix WMO had done such a great job of implementing their plan that the Board of Soil and Water Resources came and said, hey, you guys have done such a great job, you don't have anything left to check off your boxes. We're going to have you adopt a new plan a little early. Is that kind of how that went?
That's exactly how
So anyways, so they outperformed their plan in essence. So be careful about being the outperformer. But anyway, the good news was that a lot of their objectives have been achieved, and they went about developing this new plan. And what I really appreciated about what came out in this new plan is incorporation of, I'm going to get ahead of myself. Sorry. Let's stop there and go on to this. Municipal regulations, because I'm still building a case here for how many regulations so many of us have to deal with. And I'm sorry, I keep looking at you over here. I should know your name because you said you were an engineer.
Brian, I'm set up at the City West One.
Okay, Brian. So I don't know why. I'll try and quit staring at you because for some reason when we were going around the room, I thought, oh shoot, I got to be afraid of him because he's going to know something I don't. Anyways, at the municipal level, we have a variety of regulations. I mentioned the state, the county, and all those other ones. We have comprehensive plans. Do you have a name similar to that here? It's not comprehensive plan. Is it comprehensive plan? I heard something else mentioned earlier and I thought. And in that, along with the city's local surface water management plan, they're guidance documents. I think it's fair to call them guidance documents. In other words, they're not ordinances, they're not laws, they're not exactly regulations. So they provide us some guidance when it comes to how we're going to handle local surface water and that sort of thing. But it's really not, doesn't have quite the same teeth that our ordinances do. Now in ordinances, I find stormwater related, or if I can include grading related into that, because sometimes we have these overlaps. I have stormwater ordinances and zoning, and subdivisions and grading, and some of the cities have their own standalone stormwater ordinance, and shoreline bluffline, there's floodplain. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot, and you guys can, I'm sure, appreciate, there are a lot of these places where some of these stormwater regs are hiding. And it's one thing to expect you as staff or consultants or whoever to eventually get up to speed on these things. We can develop checklists and things that help us. But in fairness to those property owners and those developers, this can be quite a maze to navigate. And as I am in this business longer, you know, I start I've developed a new appreciation for those people who are being asked to comply with these things when they come in the door, or at least they come in the door asking questions. They're being asked to go away and design something that complies with these things. They don't know where all that stuff is hiding. And I think that's a perspective that I didn't really have when I first started doing the city engineer work. Even though I was doing developer work, I thought I was pretty smart at the time, you know. I thought I have this figured out. And every time I brought a project in, some city engineer would come back with like 4 or 5 pages of review comments. Man, this guy really needs to learn something about how to design a project, right? Well, I'm on the other side now, and I have perspective from both sides, and what I end up feeling really sympathetic towards is the engineers or whoever the designer is who's trying to comply with these things, and they don't know my codes. In fact, I should have brought one of the city's codes. They're almost, maybe it's good I didn't, because they would have had the city's name on it. I mean, some of them are just such a mess, and it, you know, it's costly to recodify things like that, which I can appreciate now, but it's really hard for people to get there, where they need to get an approvable project. So, Mike, what year did we start this? 2013?
2014.
14?
Yep.
So I'm going to kind of maybe give part of the presentation that Mike would be better qualified to do, but I was here for this and benefited from this exercise. In 2014, the Middle St. Croix WMO was successful in getting at least one grant to help the member communities bring their stormwater regulations into compliance with a variety of things, but to go through their stormwater regs and to update them and to incorporate some low impact standards in particular. And the state of Minnesota had gone through an exercise of developing something called MIDS, Minimal Impact Design Standards. And Mike, you're going to talk in more detail about that, right?
Yep.
So I'm not going to go into that much in detail, and Mike's a better person to do it anyway.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah,
So
right.
of those cities that are listed there and township, how many of them are MS4s and are regulated by the state or by the federal regulations?
Right, none.
None of them are MS4?
No, Bayport, no. Bayport is no.
And actually, West Lakeland Township.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Okay, so West Lakeland Township. So 2 of them. These are all pretty small communities. Bayport was only brought into the MS4 program last year, with the latest round. And I don't know when West Lakeland was. Was that last year too?
No, that was the original.
That was the original group?
Yep.
Okay, so we do have 2. But these are all the 10 communities that are in the Middle St. Croix WMO, and Mike and his staff and another gentleman, I mean Jay Michaels, went through and made this nice little matrix table and basically kind of gave us a snapshot status of where each one of these communities was with their stormwater regulations. I think this is an awesome tool if you feel like, and I think these slides are all going to be made available, right? So if you need to reference a table like this, you can do it yourself. But you look at what they're looking at for each community and what do the ordinances address. Does it address stormwater? They all have some version of yes on that column, but some of them are maybe a little weak. Are they quantifiable with performance standards? We have a mix of yes and no, but mostly no's. And alternatives process, again, Mike's going to get into detail, so I'm not going to talk about alternatives right now. Standardized processes and so on. So from this table, Mike and his group went about developing sort of a standard stormwater template ordinance and rolled that out to each of the member communities and made it available. There was a bunch that went into this. There was some education of the elected officials that went along with that. There was having each member community pass a resolution, basically, right, Mike, that committed to working with the WMO to implement what comes out of this thing here. And when the whole process was said and done, here's the summary, sorry. So 2013, grant applications, 2014, staff meetings, resolution
presentations. They did a lot of work with the city attorneys and the city engineers as well. In 15, that's where we met, where we brought us in as city engineers, had a final draft ordinance. This was
I mean, I just can't say enough how much I appreciate what Mike and Jay in particular went through with this, because since I got to sit through it with, at the time, 5 cities, it had to be a little painful at times, because, you know, you get this ordinance developed and sit down with one city, and of course, you probably can all relate to having poured your heart into something that I don't want to put something on you, Mike, but from my perspective, I've done this where I've poured my heart into something and been real excited about it, and I roll it out to my elected officials, and I get this lukewarm or suspicious response of some sort. And I got that sense sometimes with some of the elected officials, and I was kind of frustrated by that. But in 2015 and 2016 was when they were working through drafting and redrafting this ordinance, and then in 16 the final ordinances were finally adopted. And I believe the next slide is the end result. So the goal was to fill this table with yeses in every spot, and I think that's what occurred. So, so kudos to Mike and his group, and you know, the one thing I'd say about his group here is, and you probably can all appreciate this, Mike is really good about finding grants and getting grants and things like that, and with these small communities that I serve, boy, if you can come to them with an idea and a fund, you know, a funding source, it makes all the difference in the world. And that was really what made this happen in the communities down there. Technical staff, I think we talked a little bit about this, but these regulations really touch a lot of us, don't they? City engineers, I don't know why I put us on top. Why is that?
It's your perspective.
Yeah, it's my perspective, right?
I totally agree.
It's nothing to do with me thinking we're the most important in the group here. Right? The WMO, or Watershed District Administrators and Engineers, we have some DNR people who provide feedback or some input to us. Their role in Minnesota has become a little more advisory in a lot of cases and a little less regulatory, but the building official, city environmental staff, if you had, I think there was at least one person or two that would fit in the room here that fit into that category. Consultants, you know, I'm a consultant, I serve smaller cities, we do a lot of work for a lot of different sized cities, so you probably use some consultants, developers, engineers, again, for a while there, and including now, my heart kind of goes out to them because, you know, coming into a different city every time you have a developer project and you got to get out that ordinance and you just never get a chance to get intimate with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about education and elected officials. So what has worked well for elected officials? I don't know if I'm going to be telling anything new here, but these are the things that, as Mike asked me to think a little bit about what I've seen that works well for elected officials. I think, you know, workshops is easy. A lot of you do workshops here, you know, so they're less formal than your council meeting. You can have a discussion, a back and forth. They don't really take any action at workshops. You know, what I like about workshops in cities where they're not televised. And I know that we're always wanting to be transparent, and that's always a good thing. And so the fact that they're open to the public is good. But what I do find is that if any of you work in cities where workshops are less formal than that, the elected officials tend to let their guard down a little. And I find it a little easier to communicate in that environment when we can do it. Staff reports is good. You probably all give staff reports to your councils. I think appointments to boards. So again, if you have something like the WMO where you're appointing elected officials to the boards, I think that's a great educational opportunity for them. And we have certain cities that appoint the same person, you know, year in and year out. I'd like to see some of our communities that I work with kind of rotate that a little bit, just so different ones have a chance to get exposed to
to the WMO and stormwater regs and different things that we talk about at that level. Technical staff, you know, we get our education from things like conferences, continuing that through our registration and certification programs and things like that. If you're looking for ways to communicate with residents and educate them, I think this is a pretty important part. Sometimes it's a hump to get over too, because the residents are changing from time to time. You know, when I think about this education piece, my perspective comes from these parts of our cities that are in floodplains in particular is a really big one, or bluffland shoreland. And we have different regulations for those two areas, but they overlap in some respects, and geographically they overlap. And boy, I can't tell you how many times somebody has come in and bought their dream house, and that dream house maybe needs major remodeling, or maybe they're coming in to tear down that old dilapidated structure and put up their McMansion or whatever you want to call it. And when the regulations hit them in the process, it's not only a huge disappointment, but some people made big investments, and it throws off their whole project. So we try and reach them through newsletters, through the city's website and open houses, community events. We try and do, you know, if you have we've got Night to Night coming up here in a week or two, don't we? That's the old night out.
Yeah, National Night Out.
Yeah, when is that one? Do you know that date of that? Or is that the first part of, no, it's next week. I think it's next week. Do you guys do that one here? Is it
National Night Out?
Yeah.
National Night Out.
So we call it Night to Unite, I guess. I don't know if that's a state thing that we changed the name or what it is. But, you know, and sometimes there's a community central location where you've got something going on in the park, and, you know, you can put up informational things, hand out brochures and get people. But, you know, one of the, I don't know if I included it here, businesses, one where there's been a lot of work done recently through the St. Croix, all right, I'm drawing a blank, Mike, what is Natalie's?
St. Croix River Association.
St. Croix River Association did a lot of work in the last 3 years. They hired a person to almost exclusively develop some information that's targeted at builders and real estate agents. Do you have samples of that you're going to show as part of your presentation? You don't?
I'll add.
But we can add it.
Yep.
And those two groups are really important to try and hit, because they're setting expectations for their buyers.
So my question is, not only are you through these mechanisms possibly, what I'm asking is, are you communicating more than just about the regulations? Like, are you providing any kind of guidance for residents who, you know, maybe are in places where some of those regulations weren't in place, and there is a lot of stormwater runoff and other things that they want to do to help mitigate that coming off of their property? Have you guys done any kind of educational efforts to really give residents ideas of things they can do in their own landscaping to try to mitigate that?
So like on a voluntary basis?
Yes.
Yeah, so so Mike's organization, both the WMO and then the Conservation District, really, Angie's been doing a lot of that, right? There's a gal, Angie Hong, through his organization, has been doing a fair amount of that, the Blue Thumb program and some other things that roll out for the voluntary practices. And the cities try to steer people toward them whenever we have an applicant who's interested in that sort of thing. And we've had some down on Lake St. Croix Beach, and one in particular comes to mind in response to that question is a young couple that, you know, again, my heart went out to them. They were newly married, they bought this dream house, and they weren't going to do anything fancy with it at all, but they didn't really understand, it wasn't fully disclosed to them that it was in a floodplain. And the previous owners were able to continue to maintain the structure there because it had been there so long, but now they wanted to come in and do a little bit of remodeling and rehab to this building. It was going to trigger the need for them to bring it into compliance with floodplain regulations, which is going to be a real hardship for them. The upshot is that it was a I'm going to guess it's maybe, it's a two-story home, not two-story, like a lookout, we call it a lookout, a half, 1.5, if you will, but the basement is half below grade, and on a main level. I bet one level was probably 1,200, between 1,200 and 1,500 square feet, not a real big home. And there was living space on both levels, but that lower level had flooded a number of times. And so when they came in, they bought this house and they were planning to put money into it, and then they learned they can't even use the lower level. Half of their house became unusable, except for storage. And I mean, I felt terrible for them. But you know, they didn't really have a place to get that information. And so this effort with the St. Croix River Association to try and get this information in the hands of real estate agents and builders is really an important group. That the real estate, I don't know, I have firsthand experience with getting information to them. I'm a little suspicious just because, you know, you think about what their motives are, what they're doing for their jobs. It's moving properties, it's in, you know, building. But we've got to try and reach them anyway and help them understand what the importance is here. I mean, in the end, we're trying to get these properties either improved or out of the floodplain or whatever we need to do to get them in compliance. But for them, we're trying to help them to help alleviate some headaches when they set unrealistic expectations for their buyers. So again, working with elected officials, I think I did allude to this a little bit earlier, but when I was early in my learning curve as a city engineer, I had to figure out that the elected officials, who are very important to have on board here, let's see, sorry, I can't see the end of my slide. Elected officials are very important to have on board, but their values and their background is so varied. You know, some really value land rights, and almost to the extent where they don't want anybody to tell them or tell their neighbor that if they're going to do an improvement to their property, they need to incorporate a rainwater and their infiltration structure. Some are just flat out anti-regulation. I don't know if you've had any of those that I have. Some are very pro-regulation. That's the two ends of the spectrum there. Some come in because they're interested in protecting the environment. Some do have values around surface and stormwater, groundwater. What do I mean by non-stormwater? I have a couple of council members that just, anytime you bring up the term rain garden, it's like this negative, almost visceral response I get. So I stopped using it. I just say, well, infiltration practice. They seem to like that. So know your elected officials. Each one of us has a different connection to our elected officials, I'm sure. I did, when I was a very young engineer, I did an internship with the city of Woodbury. Mike mentioned that community has been a growing community in the Twin Cities area for quite a while. And, you know, they operate, and I'm going to do this in air quotes, they operate like a real city. Okay, these cities that I serve that are like 300 population don't quite fit into that same air quote category sometimes. And when I say, one of the examples is that, you know, when I was working as an intern for the public works director, city engineer, I asked him one time, you know, what do you do? This was later in my career, actually. I went back to him and I asked him, what do you do when you're dealing with a tough council member? I had a tough council member I was dealing with. I was looking for a little advice. He said, you know, I've been here for, what was it, 25 years, he said. And I had a council member call me once. And I talked with him on the phone for about 5 minutes. I hung up the phone, I picked up the phone, I dialed my administrator. And I said, so council member so-and-so talked to me today about this and that and the other thing. He said, okay, thanks for letting me know. And we hung up the phone. It's the last time I've ever heard from a council member. So you may operate like that, or not. Or you may operate like I do, and that is these council members, I go to a council meeting and it's a little bit more like a church basement meeting where it's fairly informal in some respects. Some of them do a better job of following Robert's rules than others, and you know, we have a conversation, and these council members are free to call me anytime they want. And so it really is knowing your body of elected officials and communicating with them in a way that works for them. So Mike, I think that's where I'm going to hand it back to you.
Sure.
Are you going to go into bids a little bit next? Is that what we're going to do?
Yep.
Okay. I think you've got another assignment for me when you're done.
Okay, so I thought next what we could do is we'll just jump into what our standards are. So as John mentioned, in 2006, the Middle St. Croix adopted their first performance standards, and that included volume control. So we really started implementing low impact development at that point. And then when we were told to revise our 10-year management plan early, the first thing we did was started doing a series of stakeholder involvement meetings. Some of those are in larger workshops, and quite a few of those are one-on-one with city staff, and as well as local elected officials and some active residents within the watershed, anybody that we could really talk to. What we were hearing from our communities during that stakeholder involvement process is that the volume control standards were too complicated, and they weren't flexible enough, so we kept running into these issues where we had locations where we couldn't infiltrate, and there wasn't a clear alternatives process, and then they also felt that a lot of developers and builders were coming into town, and they were having, like John said, to relearn new requirements and try to figure out what it was that we wanted. So the goals that we pulled out of all those comments were our volume control requirements need to be simpler, more flexible, and consistent with other authorities. Just about that same time, in 2009, the state legislature passed a requirement for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to develop standards to really implement low impact development and other stormwater management techniques. Basically, the way this whole process, this legislation happened is a senator's wife worked with the Soil and Water Conservation District through a voluntary cost share program, installed a rain garden. 2 years later, the senator asked the Builders Association of the Twin Cities how we can get more of these projects across Minnesota. The representative at the Builders Association, Lisa Frenette at the time, had been part of the state Stormwater Steering Committee, which was a large group of stormwater professionals from both regulatory regulatory organizations and implementers through cities, as well as some industry reps, developers in the Builders Association, etc. That group had put together a white paper on this idea called minimal impact design standards, looking to standardize volume control across the state. So they wanted consistent performance standards, the flexibility for sites where you couldn't infiltrate, and some way to standardize credits for each practice. So if you had to put in a practice, what do you get for a credit for it? And they wanted that to be the same across jurisdictions. So this group had put together that white paper and had tried the year prior to get that funded through a state funding process, and it had failed. So within 20 minutes of having that question asked, Lisa was able to hand the senator a white paper write-up on this concept of minimal impact design standards. A week later, a small group from the Stormwater Steering Committee were presenting in front of at a Senate hearing, and a month later, this was written into law. So it happened pretty quickly. But it goes to the point that the education component and that technical assistance that we provide landowners one-on-one through soil and water conservation districts is critically important to helping the public grasp this and sometimes move major pieces of policy forward. So the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, along with that state statute, was allocated $300,000 to develop these standards. And because of the collaborative environment that had been created over the prior decade through the Stormwater Steering Committee, the members of the Stormwater Steering Committee voluntarily, and then staff from the Pollution Control Agency did a number of stakeholder meetings prior to starting the process. They did 5 meetings across the state, had approximately 650 people attend those meetings across the state to kind of introduce what was the state statute about, what was the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency undertaking, and then also gathering stakeholders to be involved for the process for the development of these tools, essentially. So this is the list of organizations that were represented at the monthly meetings over the 3 years to develop and review the science and make decisions on the statewide program. This is really important, and it's the first time I've ever been through, and maybe the last time I'll ever be through a process like this, because there's a lot of people who have a lot of different values and needs that they're bringing to the table, which is why it took a while to get this work done. But in the end, it was the right process because the end result, MIDS is a voluntary program, but the end result is being adopted across the state on a voluntary basis because we met the goals of the group. We moved items forward by consensus, and this is an important concept of how you get consensus. So consensus is when you ask everybody around the table if we've reviewed enough to move to a consensus moment, and that usually took 2 or 3 meetings to build to that point, and then seeing that there are no folks dissenting, that we weren't ready for a consensus moment. Consensus is achieved when you say, all right, if you do not agree that this is the way we should move forward, please raise your hand and state why, so we can work to address it. And if nobody objects, then it's move forward. So it worked really well with a group of that size. And what we ended up with is MIDS, and it really is 4 components. The 3 basic components is the work that we got done in the 3 years, which is the standard, the credits calculator, and the model MIDS ordinance. The 4th item, design specifications or design guidance for all of these low impact development practices, came out of this process, but really that's been run by a separate steering committee led by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. That's the development of the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, which I'll talk about in a moment. So what were the new and redevelopment standards? So based on the science and the consensus of the group, the simplest approach was best. We looked at all the different scenarios. We could do pre-post analysis. We could do pre-development versus post-development. We could do a 95 or a percentage storm, like 91 to 95%. But basically, in the end, the cities, specifically as well as the development community, really just wanted the simplest standard that would get us to our goal of meeting water quality requirements. And so that was identified as 1.1 inches runoff from either new or fully redeveloped impervious surface. And I'll say fully redeveloped over and over again because that's not mill and overlay, and that's really why we use that term. It's really for linear projects. So in the project below, this is an example of a 3-lot small subdivision with a stub road. It's actually quite long coming into the development, and to meet the 1.1 inch volume requirement, you see you've got 2 BMPs here. This is the infiltration BMP for the 1.1 inches size based on the 1.1 inches off of impervious surface, and then the stormwater pond is there for both pre-treatment because it's required to have pre-treatment before your infiltration basin. So the pond fills to a certain elevation, then it starts filling the infiltration basin, and then when the pond reaches a certain elevation for rate control, then it starts outletting out of the overflow outlet for rate control.
Mike, where'd you get the 1.1 inches from? Or where did they get the 1.1 inches?
Yeah, that was a year-long process. They basically ran 30-year model runs using a combination of ArcSWAT and P8, and comparing pre-development hydrology, which was in state statute with native vegetation, to post-development runoff under similar rain events, for a range of rain events and also a range of soil types. And so 1.1 inches was the closest match we could get that they found between the two without breaking the cost-benefit curve, because there gets a point between that 91 to 97% storm event where a lot more cost doesn't get you a lot more benefit, and that was a big component of setting the standard.
And I will just comment, that's 1.1 inches of runoff compared to Iowa. Agri-Storm Management Manual is 1.25 inches of rainfall, so.
Okay, correct, yeah, so this is essentially a Kerplunk methodology, right? You take 1.1 inches off of all the impervious surfaces on the site that are new or fully redeveloped, and then you size the surface storage of your BMP for that volume. So it isn't real time, it isn't counting water running in and infiltrating while the storm event is occurring, and we'll look at that as well. But that was another one that was based on based on feedback, right? We didn't want to require every development in the state to go through a real complex modeling process. So Andy Reese termed that, by the way. Kerplunk methodology was there's an instantaneous volume across the site, and storage in the site was used for the state standard. So that's the easy bit. Well, that took a while to get to, but that was one of the steps that was actually the easiest because the science was and modeling was really clear on which way we should go. The next part that was difficult is, okay, so what about areas that have restrictions where you can't infiltrate? So this is a soil boring that just came in last year in the Middle St. Croix WMO with weathered limestone. I don't know if you have karst topography here. So it's essentially a direct conduit to the groundwater. So we obviously don't want to be injecting our surface water pollutants into our superficial groundwater or our drinking water. And so that's an area where infiltration is prohibited. And so what do we do with those? So on those sites, we developed a process called flexible treatment options, which is really just an alternatives process. And so step one in flexible treatment options is if, for example, you have clay soils, so you probably can't get the full 1.1 inches realistically into clay soils without, it's essentially breaking the development because your basins are going to get so large to get that volume in if they're going to work that you consume too much land. So in those circumstances, what we're looking for in clay soils is half of that volume and then also a 75% reduction in total phosphorus. And those again are those results are based on the outputs of the MIDS calculator. So here's a development that just went through the review process. So this one is 6. There's 7. I think this is a 7-lot. These are smaller subdivision developments. 7-lot subdivision development with a road. And so this is a biofiltration basin. So it's essentially engineered medium mix with an underdrain in it. That's coming off of the pond, so the pond is pre-treatment and also rate control. When the pond overflows, it flows back into the wetland complex this way. But for the water quality volume, it's filling the biofiltration basin on this end. So then we have sites where we have like contaminated soils, high superficial groundwater, pollutant hotspots such as petroleum stations where we can't infiltrate at all. So these are typically blind systems. So then the goal is to identify 60% TP annual load reduction. Threw a really tough one in here. So we have downtown Stillwater, which is an ultra-urban environment, almost 100% impervious, as well as high superficial groundwater and 150 years of mills buried underneath the city. So we definitely don't infiltrate anything in downtown Stillwater. So this one, because of the high groundwater, is the primary driver, but we could list a whole number. Went to the 60% TP load reduction, and the way that was achieved on this one was through some underground chambers that are sealed, as well as a in-structure jellyfish filter. So these are actually mechanical filters. In a lot of circumstances, we're able to achieve it using filtration basins. So we'll have a stormwater pond with the water quality volume going to a filtration basin that's lined, and we'll talk more about what those look like a little bit later. And then the third option is, and this is most likely to occur in really low areas with limited right-of-way on linear projects, or in downtown Stillwater, because the conditions are difficult down there. We do have an option to do equivalent treatment within the same contributing watershed area. And the process is not super well defined. We take them on a case-by-case basis right now, but we do have that option. And then I also wanted to note that linear projects have a little bit of a different standard. So a linear project is basically half of the standard because of limited right-of-way for redevelopment. So 0.55 inches for fully reconstructed impervious surfaces. Or it's 1.1 inches off of newly constructed areas. So basically, if you're doing, really what this drives is if you're doing a road reconstruction project, but you're adding turn lanes or bike lanes or additional impervious, basically your standard ends up by being 0.55 inches off of all of the fully reconstructed and new impervious surface. If you're doing a new roadway, running across an area, then basically you end up by doing 1.1 inch volume control for all of the new impervious. So here's an example. This is, I think, the approach that that we're going to see more and more of in Washington County. We've got this design now through county transportation on 5 projects. So essentially, acquiring in non-urbanized areas with swales, we do get credit for ditches, and that takes care of a portion of our volume control requirement. And then we're doing essentially in-ditch bioretention basins, some with under drains, some without, and in order to achieve our volume or our final TP reduction. And so this is a photo standing on the berm looking back this way, and essentially they're ponding water 1.5 feet deep and infiltrating that volume or overflowing the rock overflow and continuing down the swale of the ditch. So, so that was the first piece. That's really what came out of the performance standard components. The next piece came. The next component is the MIDS calculator. The MIDS calculator is basically a giant spreadsheet of P8 model runs where the pollution control agency locked down all the controls because you can tweak a lot of dials on P8. And so they locked down the controls to what they felt was conservative or representative of what was actually happening in the field. And so in the MIDS calculator, it has a graphic user interface to make it easier to use, or most engineers prefer that ginormous 2-screen spreadsheet. You can use that version as well. But basically, you input your project size, impervious area, soil type, precipitation, and then choice of stormwater practices. Then you input your parameters of your practices, and it's a quick and easy way to, before you actually go through the process of designing, to identify what you're going to need to meet which standards. If you're doing so from the Middle St. Croix perspective, we actually don't get MIDS model submittals for projects that can meet the 1.1 inch because it's pretty easy, right? By design, here's the volume that you need on your contours, essentially on your plan, and so I just check that volume is covered, and then we check to make sure that the BMP is designed, the infiltration BMP is designed within the standards of the stormwater manual, and we're good. Now, if we have an alternative process for that flexible treatment option number 1 or number 2, and we have to have both the volume and the TP credit, that's when we have the MIDS calculator come in. And then the output of the MIDS calculator is really, the important part is the volume reduction as well as the annual phosphorus reduction that was credited for the practices. And then everything in the calculator, all of the practices in the calculator are linked to the stormwater manual design guidance. I wouldn't say they actually have standards in there. They're not actually standards, it's more guidance. The only entity that really has standards in the state of Minnesota is the Minnesota Department of Transportation that we all reference for material standards, but we don't really have a true standards manual for practices, we just have guidance. Let's see. So then the final piece is the MIDS ordinance package. There's actually 2 of them that are out there. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to be providing a sheet with all of these components that I'm talking about with a web link. So I'll give you the web link to both of these ordinance package documents. The top or the bottom one was the one that was developed as part of the MIDS process, and then the top one was the final ordinance package that was developed after we kind of vetted it through our 10 partner communities on the St. Croix. They have a lot of similarities, but there's a few differences between the 2. So I should note, I wanted to share with you just a real quick one. We adopted a real quick snapshot of how this is working in our community. I think the best way to do that is with some numbers, but you have to understand a couple of components first. The Middle St. Croix, our redevelopment trigger for needing to do stormwater volume control is 6,000 square feet. The statewide MIDS standard is an acre. We, at the local level, looking at what our TMDL load reductions were, we weren't going to be able to achieve them with a 1 acre threshold, and so we brought it down to 6,000 square feet. Or if if you're in the scenic, the federally designated scenic and wild riverway area, adding more than 500 square feet along that bluffland shoreline area also triggers these volume control standards. So in 2016 and 2017, we had 30 projects that we reviewed that required stormwater treatment that met one of those two standards. 80% of those sites could achieve that 1.1 inch volume control standard, and 20%, or 6 of those sites, utilized that flexible treatment options. And the primary drivers in our neck of the woods for that was karst bedrock and clay soils for FTO number 1. The karst scenario, the karst was 14 feet below the bottom of the infiltration facility. So we consulted the state on that one, and they simply wanted under drains added to that system to ensure that exfiltration wasn't the only way to move water out of it. And so that was an under drain system, so it had to go to flexible treatment option number 1. And then FTO number 2 was 3 sites, fueling station contaminated soils and high superficial groundwater. But from what's interesting from the TMDL perspective is that 20% of those were new development sites. So really, new development for trying to meet our TMDLs really just doesn't make things worse. It doesn't really give us credit for improving conditions. And so we prevented an increase of 27 pounds of phosphorus per year from discharging to our surface waters through the new developments. And then the redevelopment, 80% of those were redevelopment in our watershed. And that reduced 131 pounds per year of phosphorus moving. And just to give you a context, regulatory isn't the only tool that we used for managing water resources or improving water resources within the watershed. So we also had 10 voluntary water quality stormwater retrofits. These targeted retrofits, I'm going to show you a little bit about that process next. But we reduced 58 pounds there as well. So in the context of our 1,500 pound load reduction, we had a good couple of years, and we made about 5% progress on that. So these are the 1,500 pounds is a big target. It's going to take a long time to get there, and we're applying all of our tools at the local level to slowly make progress towards that goal.
So Mike, did you say that MIDS is voluntary?
It is. Yep. And so maybe a couple of pieces there. MS4 communities are encouraged to adopt MIDS, and we found that most have adopted MIDS just because I think that the best part about MIDS is the flexible treatment options and that clear alternatives process. It works really well for development, and there hadn't really been anything like that in place prior to MIDS. And so I think that's the part that's really appealing. And then you basically by adopting MIDS and updating ordinances through the example ordinance package, it's pretty easy to put it in place, make tweaks for your local unit of government based on input from the Planning Commission and the City Council, and then you have a stormwater program that's complying with your federal and state requirements. But it is voluntary.
Voluntary for the cities, right? But once it's in code, compliance with those standards is not voluntary for the developers or property owners.
Right, so the cities adopt these.
Yeah, so,
and
but
then
they aren't necessarily required to adopt that into code, but for those that have.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Unless the developers are friends with the council members.
Yeah, how's it going with the developers where they've been adopted?
Good. So again, the relationship that we have is I do the watershed does the review for rate control and the water quality volumes for the MIDS standards, and the city and John does the review for all of the other city ordinances, and then the city does a conditional approval that the development meets the performance standards. And I have found that since we adopted MIDS, our review process is a lot shorter for the development community, and so we've had some favorable feedback on that. And the fact that we have a clear alternatives process has made all the difference, because I think the Where we were running into problems before is when the engineer would call and say, I don't know how to get that volume in the ground on the site because we have clay soils. And we didn't really have clear guidance on how to do that. So now the first call that I typically get from the engineer or the first contact is, here's our draft design. Would you would you like to provide comments prior to our formal submittal? And we go through it, and usually if it's a scenario that triggered the alternatives process, they've documented it already, and they've moved to the alternatives process. We verify it. We haven't had any where they've argued that they required the alternatives, because it's very clear what triggers an alternative or not. We send some initial comments back, and then our review process is a lot shorter.
What about the costs associated with the improvements? Are you finding that developers are saying implementing your guidelines ends up costing, increasing the cost of the development on that site? Or requesting a hardship grant or loan from the city to keep compliance?
Yeah, I think John, you can jump in on this one from the city perspective as well. Hardship is always, to me, relative to what's going on around you and in your immediate vicinity. There are a lot of watershed districts who have their own permit programs that have more stringent requirements than MIDS, much more stringent. And since they're out front, they tend to be the ones to field more of those complaints and requests. Since adopting MIDS for those 30 projects and all of them that we're reviewing this year, so we've already got 15 that are either in process or complete now, we haven't had any complaints. But that could be because in our environment, MIDS is the least restrictive, and again, the big piece is it's consistent. So most of the developers or builders that are submitting proposals have done a development or done buildings, home building under these same requirements and credits somewhere else, and I think that helps as well.
So how is this common, what are the most typical combination of practices that are being used, taking into consideration the whole treatment train, and if there has to be flood control as well?
Yeah, I'd say typically I'd say it's a combination of either a wet pond and an infiltration basin or biofiltration basin, or it's a infiltration basin and a dry detention basin.
But you're able to use infiltration basins because you have percolation rates in soils that are relatively high. You have sand, and we have a lot of glacial till soils, so we can't really use, in rare cases, we could use infiltration trenches, and I think it would be the other way around, where we would use bioretention first and then discharge to a wet pond or wetland or detention basin.
Yeah, and I think the reason we have we have an inverse. You'll see this as we look at projects throughout the rest of the presentation too, is that the biofiltration, if we're in sea soils, so D soils are your SMSPs and the Unified Soil Classification Code. So they're kind of silty sands, right? So once you get past silty sands and you get any bit of clay, for us it goes into clay soils. So clay soils, we're reducing. You reduce the volume, and you're looking for the 75% total phosphorus, and that combination is typically a wet pond with a biofiltration basin. But they usually put if the grades work, they prefer to do the wet pond first because the wet pond is an amazing pretreatment device. So if you switch it around and you put the biofiltration basin first, then you also have to build in an additional component because now you need pretreatment for your filtration basin before it goes to the pond.
But don't you need pretreatment in the pond before the pond?
No, we don't require pretreatment for a wet pond.
Floatables and all the stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's floatables, but the primary issue we have for bioretention or biofiltration are larger soil particles. So it's your sands and your larger silts that flush out right into the bottom of the basin. That's seal performance. So that's really, ponds do a great job of addressing those particulates and then feeding relatively sediment-free water to the bio-infiltration or filtration system, so you're extending the life. That's kind of the reasoning behind that. And I'll talk about more BMPs. I've got all the BMPs that we're implementing in order of what we see most frequently out on the ground. Yes?
This may be a question pick up later on, but from a city perspective and thinking about value of properties as you're creating these local and regional water systems, these stormwater systems, is there any of the communities you've worked with that have ever done any property value studies to see how proximity to some of these regional or micro-type installations affects their property values?
That's a great question. I can ask, I think I would ask Clayton Eccles. He's the city engineer for the city of Woodbury, and he's also on the APWA in Minnesota. If there has been a study like that, Clayton would be the one that would have seen it and have access to it. So I could pass that question along.
Yeah, we just did one in our city of Clyde.
Okay.
We have some interesting ordinances that we've created as well, and we're seeing some correlation between some of our best sort of model practices that have been implemented and how it positively affects property values as well. And so I'm looking for some other data to compare to see if that's a unique data point or if that's something that we're seeing more consistently around the region or in other cities.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll get your email and I'll email Clayton.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so I think John is up next. Did we want to take a quick break? Or just keep pushing through?
Probably take a break.
Okay, we'll just take 5 minutes.
Everybody's time here, and I guess it's my understanding, I learned on the way up, I must be living in a cave down there, but sounds like a lot of you are flood fighting right now, right?
Yes.
Or the aftermath of it anyways. Sorry about that. If it doesn't flood the St. Croix River, I guess I have to pick up on it through some other way. Anyhow, I'm going to just read, might disappear. All right, well, I may need to vamp. That's a term that we use in some, you know what vamp is?
Yeah, just
I may need to just vamp, right? Because my part here is going to be pretty short. Mike asked me to cover some things here that some of the tools that we use to manage practices at a local level. And again, if I could just reset the perspective here that I come from, because I think I do get the impression that some of you are dealing with bigger cities, bigger projects, developers in the traditional sense, and so some of the things that I'm presenting here will apply there too, but they come from the perspective of somebody who's dealing with smaller practices, private projects, redevelopment, that sort of thing. So some of this stuff is a little basic, but that's okay. We're going to talk a little bit about managing these practices and how do we go through the process from kind of beginning to end of the practice and the plan reviews and that sorts of things, and some of the things that work well. And this is the first one I put up here is develop review checklists. And we have review checklists that we use internally, which are really valuable. But I think to the extent that we can develop those checklists in a format that can be shared with the developers, and their engineers, and so on, helps us set realistic expectations right from the get-go. I must confess that this is a do as I say, not as I do. My checklists are pretty sloppy and aren't presentable, but they should be. Enforce regulations consistently. I think all good public officials sitting in the room here are probably really trying to do that. And so to the extent that you can document your reviews and make them comparable to how you've been doing things. That's not to say that we can't leave ourselves room for improvement, because that's always the case, I think, that we need to be able to complete. So I put this in here because a lot of times, as I mentioned, I'm dealing with these individual property owners who want to come, maybe they just have a simple project. They just want to put up a garage, where there wasn't a garage before, but they're going to trigger a need for some sort of EMP. And I always feel like I'm dancing this line, you know, or I look at it and say, your garage is going to cost you $20,000 to build, or $25,000 to build, and our regulation wants you to hire an engineer. You know, and it's bad enough you've got to maybe hire somebody to draw the plans, you can get your building permit just for a garage. But when it's appropriate, I find that these reviews go best when there's some sort of, I call it engineering plans, but some surveyors can pull these together too, grading plans and things like that, and some landscape architects can do it. But when you can justify it, I just think it makes everybody's life a whole lot easier going from beginning to end. Because I've done too many of these years ago where somebody wants to give me the design for their grading or their stormwater practice on the back of a napkin, if I can do it in air quotes, which I get tired of. But you know, it leaves too much room for interpretation. I had a project back in probably 2008, maybe, goes back a ways. And a nice guy right on the river bought this property and wanted to tear the house down and rebuild right on its footprint. And you know, he really wanted to submit the plans himself. And so he submitted this thing that he put together. And for those who are used to looking at grading plans, you know, a lot of times we like to see existing and proposed contours and some spot elevations and something like that. And of course, it's on the river, so I wanted in datum that I can relate to the river, the flood elevations and that sort of thing. But what he gave me was, actually I have to give him credit for giving me better work than some people do, but it was elevations measured down from the first floor in inches. And so for those of you who are on staff, I don't know if it can be a big time sink for you to work with somebody like that trying to get plans. For me as a consultant, again, us evil consultants, we have to bill for everything we do, right? And in the cities I work for, they pass my bill along to those applicants eventually. So to the extent that we can get them to submit something that's more complete, we can actually review efficiently. I think we're saving them money and we're saving confusion over the extent of the project. Because in the end, we'll get to the construction stage here in a minute, but we got to go out and review to see if they actually built what the approved plan said. So this is one you have to use your judgment on. Sometimes your ordinance will say specifically what an engineered plan is required. At other times, your ordinance gives you some latitude, like have some language that says grading and erosion control plan required, or as may be required by the zoning administrator or by the city engineer, something like that. So I think that as hard as it is sometimes, it's good to have require those plans so that we know what we're reviewing. EMP maintenance agreements, do you get into that much up here? Do you require maintenance agreements for the stormwater practices from developers or from private landowners? Can't tell, a couple of nods maybe. So those tend to be, I think they're a good tool, but I think too often they're just a checklist item. That gets, you're required to submit a maintenance agreement, it needs to follow this format, everybody signs it, it gets stuffed in a file. And 5 years later, well, what happens if they sell the property 3 or 4, 5 years later it fails in respect of the signatures and so on. So there's some work I think that needs to be done with maintenance agreements. How do you monitor them? How do you monitor these practices? Sometimes we actually have them recorded against the property at the county level. So that does help at least give you some teeth. Access easements. So hopefully when you have a stormwater practice that was required of a developer or a property owner, you require some sort of easement that allows the municipality to intervene if a structure is not being properly maintained, certainly to inspect. And during this plan review piece, does everybody leverage this tool, some sort of performance escrow? So again, with the cities I serve, they take 2 escrows sometimes. One escrow being that one that covers the cost of the plan review. And again, if you're using consultants for that, that's an important escrow to grab, because as you can probably appreciate, you get some of these plans that aren't very well prepared, and it can really suck a lot of your time to work with that applicant back and forth, right? Until you get a plan that's finally something you can call complete and even reviewable. Well, your consultant, if you're using one, may be spending half an hour here, 3/4 hour there, and all that stuff starts to add up. So if you have to use consultants, you're a smaller community, or you just have overflow work, escrow for that stage, and then also for the construction piece. So a lot of times we'll require for the construction piece on larger projects about 125% of the estimated cost of the BMP. During the construction phase, so when you can, and this is where I'm a little jealous of those of you who don't have to bill your time on a hourly basis. I don't mean to imply that you have extra time on your hands, but I would just really love to be able to meet with every contractor on site as they get started. And when I say contractor, I mean like the grading contractor. So, not the builder, although sometimes that's the only one you can meet with, but meet with the contractor early and discuss the expectations. We do, I suppose one I could have put on here that I didn't is the pre-application meetings would have been a nice one to mention. So I'll just pause for a second and talk about pre-application meetings. A few years back, we just kept bumping up against this thing where the applicants would come in with projects and not have any idea that there's a WMO or watershed district, or that there's a bluffland shoreline ordinance, that there's a floodplain ordinance, any sorts of things. And so we started to implement pre-application meetings. And by show of hands, does anybody do anything that sounds like it would fit in that category? A few of you do. Found that especially if you have these areas that are complex, like I say with bluffland, shoreline, and floodplain, pre-application meetings can really head off a lot of confusion, because and we will invite, usually the pre-application meeting is determined by whoever the first point of contact is at the city. So if that's an administrator, zoning administrator, your building department, whoever they go to first is the person who is kind of the clearinghouse and decides where a pre-application meeting would be appropriate. And we've gone to the extent of inviting, again, depending on where it's located, we'll invite a DNR representative, we'll invite Mike from the WMO, I'll come as the city engineer, we'll invite the building official, and the city zoning administrator will come, and then the applicant is welcome to bring their design people if they have any of the contractor. And we go through all those requirements that apply to their specific project. I think it's been a hugely successful tool. It does take a little bit of coordination, but I think it's really, really valuable. Anyway, get back to construction phase. Meet with the contractor early. Periodic check of erosion control measures. This is pretty key now. With NPDES, of course, they're required to do their own inspections. I don't know that I know that they don't always do them like I'd like them done. And I think they can do a much better job. But if you have staff available, going out to check these erosion control measures from time to time is a good tool if you can do it. Now this applies, when I wrote this one, I really had in mind these small projects. So an individual residential or small commercial property that's redeveloping, if we can get out and inspect the grade just prior to restoration, that again can save them headaches and the cost of like tearing up newly applied sod, putting a grade right, and things like that. So I do think that's a really good tool. Inspect to confirm establishment such as basically your final inspection in the construction phase. Post-construction. So when construction is done, if we can require as-built drawings to confirm, you can tell so much by standing out on the site and looking to see what's been built. But if you're talking about a BMP that has a specific volume requirement, that has a specific overflow elevation, for instance, on the more complex ones, you might have weir widths and, all those sorts of things that you might need to verify. But to require an as-built drawing before you release the balance of their financial security. Make sure that easements and maintenance agreements are recorded where appropriate.
time and time again, I'll find an old project at these cities that we work in where, you know, this was just dropped. Either they forgot to get the easements, maintenance agreements all together, or they got them, stuck them in the file at City Hall and never recorded them. So, in fact, we don't have legal access to do inspections. Review the conditions of approval. So this is really asking, reminding us to go back to the initial review stage. The city, you know, when I do a city engineer review, I usually have a memo that sometimes starts out a few pages long. And depending on the project, we may be able to get away with some of my comments becoming conditions of approval instead of actual, you know, make a revision before we approve your project. A lot of times that's what happens with Mike's comments too, they get incorporated as conditions of approval. Again, too often, they then get forgotten. And so if we go back then and look when the project's nearing completion to see did they actually comply with all those conditions. So reflections on the evolution of the regulations. So this was a process that if you're feeling like, or if you're at the doorstep of starting a process to evaluate and revise your regulations, you know, it's really helpful to get the group together and identify, define your objectives, and go back to those from time to time. Engage stakeholders. Mike had such a great example of that big stakeholder group and through the state process. These things really should never be done in a vacuum, in my opinion. As staff and technical people, we have a lot to offer, but I think without the perspective of the people these are going to affect most, the contractors, the property owners, the developers, I think we're really missing something and setting ourselves up for, if nothing else, a lot of headaches. Coordinate with other jurisdictional agencies. I realized I didn't really spend any time on this earlier, so I use the opportunity to do this now. Mike mentioned that this process that the WMO brought the cities through of adopting the essentially MIDS ordinance, what the bottom line for me and my job is that the best thing that came out of that is both the city and the WMO and the watershed district, all three really, have now adopted nearly identical stormwater performance standard requirements. So pretty much gone are the days where an applicant comes into me, gets a city engineer review, and I say, oh, by the way, you need to go to the WMO. And then they go to the WMO and get, okay, well, that doesn't quite meet our standards, so I need to make some other changes here. And then because they've made some changes, they need to come back to me to see if it still complies with the city. So those days are pretty much gone now. And to the extent that you could pull this off, I realize that it's almost a Herculean effort to do this. Mike talked about how many years and focus groups and all these sorts of things, but try and get these things coordinated as best you can. And in fact, sorry to keep talking about consultants and costs, but I know that that's a concern about from some of the residents in particular that have to pay for what we do. But what's been great about this here in our situation is I've been able to maybe scale way back on some of the city engineer stormwater review stuff that I do on a particular project because Mike's doing it. And the cities are funding Mike through this joint powers agreement, so there's no reason for us to duplicate effort anymore. And I think everybody, whether it's a cost thing or just the value of your time, the extent that you can reduce redundancies like that, something like that is really valuable. Okay, so that's about the same definition. So, inform and educate elected officials. This is an ongoing or rolling exercise, isn't it? Because there's one or two cities where I work where the councils don't change a lot, and then there are others that are changing constantly. And so this can be just this ongoing thing, just adopted as part of what you do for a living. Keep your elected officials informed. And again, this might depend a little bit on how your structure is organized and how closely you work with those elected officials as to how that actually works. I threw this in. This doesn't really feel like it necessarily fits here, but I don't want to lose it. I find that there are quite a number of people who
don't understand this connection we have between surface water and groundwater. And so forgive me for shoving it in here on reflections of evolution, but I didn't want to forget to mention it either. I think helping people understand that connection and what they're doing on the surface and what is eventually our drinking water is an important one for us to help them understand. That should probably have gone into the education piece. And then MIDS, or maybe more specifically the process that the WMO took us through to adopt MIDS, has been a game changer for the communities that I serve. And so, and again, it may not be the specifics of MIDS, but the idea of having something that's simple, easy to follow, easy to understand, and consistent across a couple of different agencies has been a game changer. So that's what I got for right now.
Okay.
You got some more, Mike?
Yep, I back up.
Thank you.
All right, so I've got a couple of pieces here real quick. I'm just going to go through this one real quick. I mentioned that we've been talking a lot about regulatory programs, and we do quite a bit more than regulatory for managing our water resources. And then I thought, I thought you guys should see all these awesome pictures of the beach, since that's one of the best parts about the Middle St. Croix. This is where I spend most of my days. So I mentioned that in 2016 and 2017, we did 10 voluntary water quality projects. So there's quite a bit of work that leads up to these projects. So just looking real quick, here's the Middle St. Croix WMO. These documents over the left are actually sub-watershed analysis documents, and we'll start with Lake McCusick. So here are the drainage catchments to Lake McCusick. Then it goes down to Lily Lake. Here are the drainage catchments to Lily Lake. Lily Lake is here. We've got the Lake St. Croix direct north. So this green area down to this point, this is Bayport down here through Stillwater. This is all highly urbanized. So that's one analysis. Perro Creek, which is a small historic creek that discharges to Lake St. Croix, and then we've got Lake St. Croix direct south. So all of these areas directly drain to the St. Croix, but these are more large lot, low density developments. So each of these reports, this was a GIX exercise to identify these subcatchments, and then field work to verify that they are actually outletting, because in some areas, like I said, we do have sandy soils, and while it shows in our GIS data that they're connected, when you actually go look at the invert elevations, because we don't have the best data throughout the watershed, so we actually had to go and measure some invert elevations, and the storage behind them, they may discharge in a 10-inch event, but they typically don't discharge on an annual event, and so we took them off of our priority list for improving water quality. So after that initial work, then we look at each of those catchments specifically, and we look at potential locations for BMPs, best management practices for water quality. We identify what specific BMPs we think we can do there on the desktop analysis, and then we spend a good part of a year as we can fit it in with our workload going out to each of those sites and then verifying the suitability of the site and verifying the type of BMP. We run it through each best management practice through a model, typically WinSlam or P8, depending on who's doing the modeling at the office, to assign a load reduction. We assign a cost on it based on the type of BMP and a cost matrix, and each report has a cost-benefit ratio analysis for BMPs in each of those individual catchments. So this is what really drives our retrofitting, our targeted and prioritized retrofits in the watershed. So we've got many decades of work to do, but when we see grants like federal 319 grants come out, or if there are state grants available, we go right to our sub-watershed analysis and look where we're at in our prioritized projects list. Our education and outreach efforts are focused from the Conservation District are focused on the landowners at the tops of those lists. We're always sending them letters and trying to make new contact with the folks on those lists when they're on private property, or a lot of these that are in public right-of-way, communicating with the city. When there's a redevelopment project in one of these areas, we have a list of potential areas where we saw for BMPs, and we have goals that we have for load reductions. So this is really how we get that work done. So how have we been doing so far? The Lake McCusick sub-watershed analysis was put together in 2008. In 2013, that water was delisted from the impaired waters list. We got a lot of projects in through redevelopment and through voluntary retrofit, and we got that one off the list. Lily Lake is a small lake in the heart of Stillwater, which is the birthplace of Minnesota. This is a picture from the 1950s. It's 55 feet deep at its deepest point, so it's essentially, it was historically a superficial groundwater-fed lake. Water was passing from the west, heading out to the St. Croix. And it was especially known for its clarity, but in the 60s and 70s, Stillwater had a lot of flooding issues, being a historic city. And in the 60s and 70s, they went through and did a lot of stormwater drainage improvements, but most of that ended up in the lake. So by the 1990s, Lily Lake was impaired for phosphorus for recreation. So there's a number of studies that were done and a number of projects from 1997, 98 timeframe up till 2007, 2008 that identified, it actually got a lot of projects done, identified the load reductions that we needed to get Lily Lake off the impaired waters list. Since those studies were done, we've completed a large list of projects. Our goal reduction from Lily Lake is 145 pounds. We're counting for 100 pounds load reduction so far, and so we're at the final 45 exclamation point, underline, bold and red for this next 4 or 5 years. And so the hardest part about this is that in an all urban watershed, that final 30% of the load is the most difficult and the most expensive. But the good news is the work that we've done so far, we do annual monitoring on the lake, and it actually is, in 2014, the long-term trend transitioned from flat to improving. Prior to that, in the 1990s, it was on a declining trend, so lake response time is pretty slow, so steering the ship takes a while, but the indicators from the lake are what we're doing is working. So if we're targeting those final projects, we went back to the sub-watershed analysis, which is based on modeling. Modeling was great for the first 2/3 of the projects that we were putting in, but if we were really going to get this delisted, the lake has to respond. We have to get 2 of 3 things. We either have to get secudus depth, we have to get 2 of this, either secudus depth, the phosphorus concentration in the lake, or chlorophyll A. So we got to get 2 of those. To make sure that we're doing that, we just decided that it was, before we invested a lot of money in BMPs, we would monitor the outfalls into the lake. So here are the major areas, and then each of these triangles are the outfalls. And then here was the result of that. What was a surprise, not picked up in modeling, is that this small watershed right here was responsible for 35% of the load to the lake. So we were using Windslam, which is arguably one of the best models out there right now for urban watersheds. But the difficult piece is that our models just don't pick up these little nuances. Lots of topography. Really the big piece here is lots of topography. It's pretty shady. So I think we're getting, well, you can see in the samples right here, that we're getting a lot of particulate phosphorus coming off from the small watershed. So this is that watershed compared to the other watersheds, the larger watersheds, and so we're seeing a lot bigger loads than what the model would predict. Then the second largest one, this is actually, this Greeley Street base is actually water coming from a wetland, and it's a huge volume, millions of acre feet of water at a very low concentration, so that's actually not a very good target for us. So we're targeting the next one, Lake Street. So we looked at those 2 catchments, and if we could get those 2 catchments, that's 60% of the annual contribution based on our monitoring. And so what we're currently working on is we're at 60% plans for this BMP located here, basically cutting off this watershed. It's a large bio-infiltration area. We were expecting that it would be biofiltration, but when we got the soil borings back, we miraculously had A soils. I didn't have any borings in this portion of the lake, and it's extremely variable around Lily Lake. So we weren't expecting to get good soils here, but we've got them. And then the other one is an underground infiltration system at here. This is a 33-acre catchment, and based on, this is very similar to one that was to an underground infiltration system that was installed by the Capital Region Watershed District in 2006, and since 2006 they have continuous monitoring data on the system performance, and so in a great report, and so we went through the report and made some minor design tweaks, primarily to pretreatment. We tripled the size of pretreatment because they were getting particulates penetration into the infiltration chamber cells. And we're confident that we're going to be able to achieve 80% load reduction from that 33-acre site using that. So for Lilly, the process is we're currently finishing up the feasibility report to do those. We're going to get them installed hopefully in 2019, 2020. We have an inlay analysis done. We've got some inlay treatment to do in 2021. And then we strongly believe that we're going to make 2 of those 3 standards and be able to delist Lily Lake the way we did like with Cusick by 2022. Lake St. Croix is a little bit longer time frame. What I want to point out here is just maybe a closer look at that sub-watershed analysis report. So if you open up the sub-watershed analysis, this is the level of detail that we have in here. Each of the colors of the dots is really based on cost-benefit analysis. Let's see, which way is it going? The red dots are the most expensive. The light blue dots are the least expensive per pound. And then because we had this done, I'm going to fly in a bunch of green dots here. These were a portion of the projects that were installed in that 2016 and 2017 timeframe. So we're actually achieving our goals. So we didn't get all of the dots in the locations that we wanted, but we did get quite a few of them. And then we had a couple of larger BMPs, like that one right there, that actually during a drainage study, we realized that we could divert a much larger portion during road reconstruction projects to that BMP, which we were able to do. So we were able to eliminate a lot of smaller BMPs by getting in one large infiltration basin. So here's our 2022 plan for Lake St. Croix drainage areas that we're going to be implementing. Essentially just keep doing what we're doing on those for quite a while. Let's see. Oops, I didn't mean to leave that slide in there. So that's an overview of what we're doing for our retrofitting plan, which I think complements our regulatory programs quite well. But I think it's important to note that there's lots of different tools for managing our water resources, and that retrofit program is a really important one for us. Okay, so the next piece that I wanted to really touch on, the question was asked earlier, and this was something that when we looked at the title of the presentation we thought was important, which is what tools are we actually using to achieve all these standards? There's a wide range. I put together just a quick overview of the practices based on the frequency that we're seeing them used. But this is kind of like a game of buying stock, right? So we have stock right now that we're heavily invested in and is giving us great returns. That would be bioretention and infiltration basins. Easily the best tool that we have in the toolbox when we have the soil conditions and the green space in order to implement them. And I wanted to point out too, there's a misconception that bioretention has to be perennial plants. We have a lot of successful projects out there that are turf, and I think that's one of the evolutions that we're kind of seeing in bioretention is basically we're disguising it in the landscape, in our turf areas, and we're coming up with better approaches for design on how to do that successfully. So a lot of these are essentially our AB soils amended with a compost, leaf litter, certified weed-free leaf litter compost that we have a standard for, and that's because we don't want to put topsoil in it because that inhibits the infiltration capacity, but the compost allows us to grow vegetation and still retain that infiltration capacity. So I'm just going to give you some pictures of turf basins. Here's a turf basin on a residential lot. So this is meeting the mid standard. There's actually another one over here, but this one's a little bit deep. The one over here, I actually didn't put the picture in it because it just looks like lawn. You can't see it. The key to blending it into the lawn is 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 side slopes instead of 3-to-1, and then minimizing depths. So for growing turf, I always recommend that you do a foot of ponding depth or less, even on A soils, and then the water's really gone within 4 to 6 hours after the rain event, especially in these areas. Or you can do on residential lots. This is an example of a meeting the 1.1 inch volume requirement for a home on the bluff for the entire area of the reconstructed house. more of a perennial garden approach. We're seeing implementation across all developments. Everybody's taking a little bit of a different spin on it. And in this particular case, this is actually transitioning from pure infiltration to systems that are both infiltrating and filtrating. So this was just installed a couple of years ago. And really, the designs for these are engineered media, 2 to 3 feet deep, with an underdrain. A key component about that underdrain, though, the underdrain is not on the bottom of that engineered media where it's interfacing with the native soils, but it's suspended. North Carolina State University's research really showed that this area called the internal water storage area and bioretention does a great job of improving the performance for volume control and for nutrients, well, basically across the board for the performance of bioretention basins if you keep that underdrain off the bottom. And that's reflected in the MIDS calculator, so it kind of happens automatically. But just a note, they don't look that good during construction. And this is, I think, one of the places where we really struggle with infiltration practices is the standard construction operation is to dig your basins, dig and grade your basins and your landscape first, and then come back and put your roads and your infrastructure in, and then stabilize the site at the end. What we found is the most effective for keeping these systems operating is when you have that 2 to 3 feet of soil replacement, because you're doing a combination infiltration-filtration system, the state requirement actually overall is that you can't excavate within 3 feet of the final grade until all the contributing watershed is stabilized. So in this circumstance, they basically graded this to the pretty close to the final elevation for what will be the bottom of the biofiltration cells. But now what they're going to do, now that all of the homes are done and everything's stabilized, they're going to come in, landscape crew, the last thing they're going to do is they're going to excavate out that 3 feet of soil to put in the engineered media and the underdrains. And so you've now protected the soil that's really driving the infiltration rate is at the bottom of that 3 feet of excavation. So they can drive over it, they can pile things on it. It actually works great. So that's one piece that I would make sure is part of your standards for infiltration basins is they can excavate within 3 feet until everything is stabilized. Here's another one. This is another combination infiltration-filtration system. Same type of design at an intersection. And again, this looks like turf, but those are actually sedges at the bottom. This one's a little bit wet. This year they're going to be doing a little bit of work to improve the drainage. This biofiltration basin was constructed in the like 2006, 2007. So it's actually been operating quite well, but they're going to make some improvements. And then we also have a large number of systems that have the underdrain in them, and then this particular area they were borderline soils, or BCs, and it was variable. We did soil borings at each one of these locations, and they were all identified as B soils. We did a dozen of these curb cut 250 square foot bioretention basins. Our lesson learned with doing bioretention is that if you put it in without an underdrain and it doesn't work, it's basically reinstalling it. So our solution to that has been to put these in with an underdrain, and then we use a gate valve on the underdrain. So all of them go in with a gate valve that's accessible from the surface and it's closed. And in this circumstance, all 12 went in. Soil borings look great. We should have had these soils, and 10 of the 12 infiltrated within usually 24 hours, and we had 2 that just would not infiltrate. So it held water for 72 hours or longer. So the fix was we took a wrench, popped open the casing, reached in and cracked the underdrain. We didn't even crack the gate valves. These are 4-inch underdrains, and you don't even need to open them wide up. Usually they're wide open. We're usually just a quarter or half, and then they drain down within 24 hours. You save the planting pallet. We're hoping over time that as the root mass establishes and the soils loosen back up, that they'll function as pure infiltration. But we know from the research that because the underdrain is suspended off the bottom, that we're actually still getting really good removal. So it's not a loss from the watershed perspective. And it also is functioning much better than a failed system, which would actually add phosphorus to the overall system. So there's my little filtration piece, and then I wanted to move to bioretention for filtration. And so this is the holiday station. I want to just point out this combination system. So pollutant hotspot in case of petroleum spills, we definitely don't want to infiltrate here. And so the design solution for this to get our 60% plus TP removal, because this holiday station was done in collaboration with a county roadway construction project, so this is treating both. We have a wet pond here, and then there's a inverted stormwater pipe, so that this end is submerged underneath, under the surface of the water of the pond. So that way, if we do get petroleum floatables, they stay on the top because the water pushes through with head pressure. Then it comes in here. This is a sealed biofiltration basin with I'll talk about iron enhanced sand filters in a moment. This half is biofiltration media, and then there's an iron enhanced sand filter here through the area where the underdrain is running through. So we're using quite a few approaches like this when we have areas with that high superficial groundwater or petroleum hotspots. And then the big piece, so the second most commonly used approach is, I would say, would be swales, just because we do a lot of linear projects, and probably the big deal about swales, I'm not going to put a picture in here because we all know what they look like, is that we finally have a way to give them credit. And so the really fascinating piece about the MIDS calculator in swales is that there's two components. There's the bottom of the channel, and really what you put in is channel length. The width is important, the slope, of course, the underlying soil hydrologic group that you're anticipating, and then your Manning's end, your resistance for your vegetation. So this does a pretty good job of reducing volume of stormwater, but the component that really matters is the side slopes. So the side slopes actually, when you input the parameters here, this is really the component that determines how much credit your BMP gets. So we're finding that, and this is based off of the PCA's, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's work on the literature, and also a lot of monitoring that's been done by the University of Minnesota using modified Philip Dunn hydrometers in order to do lots of sampling across MnDOT swales across the state. But what we're finding is if we can get 4-to-1 slopes and we can lengthen the inside slopes of those swales out off of linear projects in our swales, we can get really close to our volume, so we don't need to do a lot of additional basin work, which makes a lot of sense. There's been a lot of other states that have found had similar results. So then, after we move away from swales, now we're getting into, we have been seeing more underground infiltration systems as of the last couple of years. And really the big piece is A soils are my preference, AB is what's allowed by the state. Pre-treatment is critical for these, and then access to the pre-treatment chambers. The storm tech chambers guidance is great. They have an isolator row, which is basically one row that's sacrificial, and the water goes into that, first flush goes into that with all the particulates, and then the cleaner water bypasses that and fills up the actual infiltration chambers. The other piece that we look for is a high flow bypass. We've had some proposals that we can put these in and we can move 10 CFS or greater through them. They're built for that kind of rate passing through the cell. But then they always recommend to put a geotextile liner on the bottom. And research and experience tells us that geotextile liners, when they're the finest filter in the system, they basically clog up with silts and clays relatively quickly. And so we require a high flow bypass on those. So basically the concept for all of these water quality practices is we want to get that first flush of rain, we want to get the dirtiest water in our BMP, and then as the rain keeps coming, we want to bypass the water behind it, because typically that's a lot cleaner and cooler, and we don't want to keep pushing that through our water quality BMP and flushing all the dirty water out the other end. The other piece is that if you think about pond design, a lot of that inlet-outlet, as far at the opposite ends of the basin, what's driving that is our pond design concept. And ponds have a dead pool, in them, and that dead pool is there to prevent scour as the water moves across it, and separating the inlet from the outlet is a good thing because Stokes' law has longer to act, right? So you get finer and finer particles falling out of the water as it slows and moves across the basin. But in a bioretention basin or an infiltration basin, it's actually working. It doesn't have a dead pool, and the goal of that basin is to capture the first flush. And it's not dropping it out through Stokes, it's basically getting that dirtiest water and then infiltrating or filtrating it to treat it. So ideally, you want your inlet to also be your outlet. And that's a design parameter thing that we do with weir walls. Low flows divert into the BMP. When the BMP is full, it backs up the pipe and then backs up to the top of the weir wall and then overflows and continues down the system. So anyway, there's my little thing on high flow bypass. But we're really looking for those in these systems. And then here's our pretreatment chamber, and then filling the other chambers. And then we do have a section for that in the NITS calculator as well. So once you kind of move through those infiltration BMPs and you start talking more about filtration, I like taking the work that was done by the University of Minnesota and thinking about putting filtration into the context of what are we actually dealing with as far as size of pollutants in our stormwater. So if you look at a stormwater sample, you're going to have a spectrum of larger materials, sands and gross solids, and then you're going to start getting a little bit finer into your silts, really fine with your clays, and then you get into the 45 micrometers, you start getting into colloidals or soluble constituents. When we're working with phosphorus, this is a big deal. Because, of course, if we're going to go through all the expense of installing a best management practice, we want to get as much of the load as possible. We really want to get the true 80% of total phosphorus, not just the 50%, which is typically what the particulate load is in stormwater. So I should probably clarify that. The other research that the University of Minnesota showed is that 50% of the load is from that clay spectrum and to the right, and 50% of the load is from is in your colloidals or your dissolved. So stormwater ponds, one of the challenges that we've had, why they haven't been working so well for water quality, is they really don't treat that other 50% of the load. Soluble phosphorus comes in and goes out, and there's other things that we're learning about them even as we speak that make them not ideal for water quality. But so goes science and learning as we do. So when I think about BMPs for filtration, and really what we're driving towards the first section is treating these larger particulates and this gross solids. And then as it comes into our filtration system, we want our filtration to bind trace hydrocarbons, metals, bacteria. Does anybody know why a biofiltration basin works well for bacteria? Right, so we get like 80 to 90% removal of bacteria in these biofiltration basins. And the reason is that protozoa live in soil, and protozoa eat bacteria. So when you run your protozoa, or when you run your bacteria-infested water through soil, it becomes a hunting ground for protozoa who are living in the soil, and that's actually where we're getting our bacteria reductions. It's kind of cool. Anyway, so if we can infiltrate that water, then we get the whole rest of the spectrum, right? So we're good. But if we have slow draining soils, then we have to go to filtration. We have two options. So our typical filters, with the media that we're using can get pretty close to the end of the clays. It will filter down to some of the finer clays, but some of about the mid-range of clays, but the finer clays will actually pass through. But still, most of our filtration devices are not getting that other 50% as well. Like a sand filter will not get colloidals or clays. So the University of Minnesota did quite a bit of research looking at iron-enhanced sand filters and found that iron-enhanced, when you mix 5% iron with sand and you put it in as part of your filtration system, as that iron rusts, it becomes a phosphorus magnet, and it can bind 80% of that soluble phosphorus for a term of 30 plus years. So there's the data on that. They looked at actually a number of different iron mixtures, and the iron filings starting at year 1 based on concentrations, average concentrations that are published, and dosing demonstrate that we're still when we're at the 5% level of iron, we're still above 80% removal after 30 years. Now there is an upper limit. They found when they got up above 10, up in the ranges of 10 to 12%, the iron as it rusted created a matrix and kind of created its own mineral, like a big rock on the top of the iron enhanced sand filter. So Minnesota has been for quite a few years now implementing these iron enhanced sand filters, and here's an example of how we've been incorporating them in when we get into filtration. So this is that big project, the big green dot that flew up in our retrofit BMP. That's a 12 earlier. That watershed going to that area is 12.16 acres. The iron enhanced sand filter is down here in yellow. Is about 3,700 cubic feet of iron enhanced sand. It has a capacity binding capacity of 100 pounds. So we try to size them to last 30 years essentially. Our total load reduction is 10 pounds of phosphorus per year for this entire system, and then annually we're expecting about 4.5 pounds of phosphorus to be bound. So the way the system works, the water inflows into the wet pond. The wet pond fills, again, offline design. When it gets to a certain point, it spills over into the biofiltration media, which is a sand and peat mixture that doesn't leach phosphorus, as well as an iron enhanced sand filter on the backside. The only outlet for this area is through an underdrain. So the water starts underdraining right away, but in order to get to the underdrain, it has to pass through the iron enhanced sand area as well as to get to the underdrain. So that's where we're getting the phosphorus reduction. As the pond continues to fill, when it hits a critical elevation, which is about 2.5 feet of depth in this basin, then it starts overflowing through the outlet of the pond and bypassing. So we're not pushing all of that pond water for those larger events through the iron enhanced sand filter. And that's what it looks like. There's our pond, beautifully scummy with lots of soluble phosphorus. And when this is the material that flows over into the iron enhanced sand filter when we have rain events. So, that iron enhanced sand filters are becoming more common for us. We're learning a lot more about research. So as far as stock goes, I would say that we're partially invested in it, and I would continue buying stock on that one because I think it's going to be one of the long-term solutions if phosphorus is your targeted pollutant.
Mike, what is the source of iron filings in Minnesota?
So right now we're buying iron filings from GM Conley out of Chicago. So that was the source that we found. Is basically shredded iron from machinery. So we're recycling machinery, and it's tested that it's been very consistent over the 8-9 years that we've been using it, and it's tested really low on other contaminants of concern. So it's been a really good source. One of the studies that's going on right now that should be completed next year is looking at when you put iron in an iron enhanced sand filter and you give it chemistry and wetting and drying periods, it actually mineralizes into a whole bunch of other different types of iron minerals. And those iron minerals have different affinities for binding. And so we're learning a lot right now about iron mineral or raw iron and the minerals that it forms and how to improve performance of these over the long term or ensure that they're going to be performing like we anticipate. So I'm guessing next year we'll have a lot of good data, a lot more data on that. So the other one that we're using a lot of, hydrodynamic separators, just in areas where we need pretreatment or we can't really do anything else. So before we go to the step of doing treatment in another watershed, hydrodynamic separators are kind of our last stop. Usually we're getting about 20%, 15 to 20% total phosphorus reduction with them. But we're at a point where we need treatment everywhere, so we can't just discount an area and not do anything. So we are, and we will continue to use something in hydrodynamic separating devices to get treatment, either for pretreatment for larger BMPs or for treatment in areas where we can't do anything else. Trees are another one. We're using a lot of tree trenches, not so much in the middle of St. Croix, but around the metropolitan area. Two major projects. One is the 6-mile light rail line project that was done right through the middle of Minneapolis and St. Paul. The other one was a 70-acre retrofit of the Maplewood Mall. Basically, the way tree pits work is water infiltrates into a rock layer that has the rock is coated with a clay silty material. It's called CU soil mix. It was because it was developed by Cornell University. Some of the water actually infiltrates. Other water is retained and is taken up and evapotranspirated by the trees. The other thing the trees do as they get older, their canopy spreads. They're really actually efficient conduits for capturing stormwater and moving it down to their base. And so as they get larger and as we get old growth trees, because we're giving them rooting space in our urban environments, our urban built environments, we're going to get older trees. We're anticipating at least 60 years, if not 80 years. They'll actually do a great job of intercepting and pulling that water down into the system as well. Those are the concepts of how it works. This is what it looks like for installation. This was up along the light rail corridor. So essentially, here, maybe I should look at this one first. The light rail corridor has the stormwater pipe is perforated and there's a storage layer underneath here, and then water coming in off of the sidewalks before it gets to the street is intercepted by permeable pavers and then infiltrates into this area, which is the CU soil mix that the trees are growing in. And then so you can see, here's the CU soil mix with the permeable pavers on top. The Maplewood Mall was a little bit different, but fairly similar. Storage layer underneath here, choker cores, and then the CU soils were up here and then in the pits themselves. And then these had suspended under drains instead of stormwater conveyance. This acts more as like input, these are more output. And then this is what those tree pits look like as they were going in underneath the parking lot. So the actual area that you see is a really small area compared to the actual basin itself that they installed. So I would say that for larger scale projects, we see tree pits as being something to continue to invest in. I think they're going to become more popular as we kind of work out the details through these projects on which species of trees are going to live the longest. How can we efficiently how can we refine the installation process to be more efficient and standardized, and how do they perform over the long term? How do we keep them performing? And both of those projects are being their performance is being monitored annually by both of the watershed districts. So we're year 4 or 5 into both of those, and we're going to be getting a lot of additional information to inform design in the near future on those as well. So the big one in Minnesota, this is I think a stock that we should invest in. We haven't been putting a lot into it in the prior 2 decades, but it really has the potential for growth. Our stormwater reuse and irrigation. This is an example in the city of Woodbury. This one is in Washington County, just on the other side of the border from the Middle St. Croix watershed. Essentially looking at, you know what, I didn't automate this slide. That's why I was missing some information here. Hold on, let me move this over for a second. Sorry about that. There we go. Just a specific project. This is a 70-plus acre urban drainage area. It comes through a couple of ponds across the golf course and then into Colby Lake. Colby Lake is impaired for phosphorus, and so the city's been trying to figure out how to reduce stormwater volume. The city of Woodbury also has dedicates a lot of its potable water supply to irrigation during the summer. So water use for summer is another big driver for the city in particular for looking at stormwater reuse. So the plan for this project was to basically stop the water reduce the volume discharging to Colby Lake by essentially rerouting it back to where the irrigation controls are. The system is here, so they're routing it back into this pond. They're using this pond to draw irrigation for the system. The results of that one, which is now Eagle Valley, is about 3 or 4 years old. They're utilizing about 22.5 million gallons per year from the pond for irrigating the golf course, and seeing a reduction of about 56 pounds a year going to Colby Lake, which the TMDL load reduction for that lake was 30 pounds. So we are kind of transitioning towards an environment in Minnesota where we do more active control of stormwater using pumps, smart controls, and irrigation. And that's probably a trend that's going to continue into the future. And I have a feeling the systems are going to get smarter in the next decade. Permeable pavers are kind of falling to the bottom of the list. They're great in some applications. I think that what we're seeing the majority of the industry go to permeable pavers instead of concrete and asphalt. Concrete and asphalt have had a lot of quality control issues over the last decade. I think that's safe to say. Permeable pavers out of the three have been the most durable and dependable. I think that the big thing that we struggle with at the local level is unless you're doing large projects and you have vacuum sweepers already in place, the maintenance, the long-term maintenance for them is problematic. And a lot of times to try to minimize costs, there were a lot of attempts early on to do small sections of parking lots with permeable pavers and have a lot of water running on. But basically what that resulted in is more rapid sedimentation of the small openings. And so we're not seeing as much of them in our area as we did 5 or 6 years ago, because the industry hasn't really been able to, I think, maybe, what's the best way to say that? People, the customers, the people who are paying for the projects, do not believe that the industry has been responsive enough to figure out a way to better maintain these and keep them functioning. Maybe that's a safe way to say it. Not that I'm poo-pooing them. Permeable pavers still have a place, but they're lower on our list locally. Wet ponds. Okay, so these are at the bottom of the list, but it's not because they're not important or we don't use them as much. It's just for water quality. They're not as effective, and so we're seeing them still as part of all of our developments for rate control. And I just thought I'd point out that in the calculator, basically for the MIDS calculator, they essentially assigned 3 levels of design for load reduction. Level 1, really the TP reduction for a lot of our ponds is about 34%, with the knowledge of what's happening with the dissolved and particulate phosphorus. Level 2, where we're doing pre-treatment like 4 bays beforehand, and we're like increasing the water quality volume in the pond, the water quality volume, storage area in the pond, etc. And you're not intersecting with groundwater. They're doing better. They're getting about 50% of the total phosphorus. And then level 3, you can get up to 60%. The big piece, and this is relatively new, that came out from the University of Minnesota this summer, is that stormwater ponds can and some of them are a source of phosphorus loading in watersheds. And there's dynamics that are occurring in the ponds that are transforming particulate-bound phosphorus into soluble phosphorus and then flushing out of the ponds. So this is a really big deal because we've invested a lot in ponds. And so it's relatively new information, but I just thought I would share it. And the Minnesota City Stormwater Coalition is having the first meeting. The preliminary report came out from the University of Minnesota last month. And we're having our first big roundtable on it on July 19th about a little bit more overview and getting questions answered about the science and what evidence there is, and then also kind of discussing strategies of how we're going to move forward with ponds in the future, wet ponds for water quality. All right, that was a lot. I have more. Does anybody have any questions before I transition here? No? Okay. So those are the BMPs, and then I also, on the punch list, just had real quick sharing what we're doing for maintenance. And I'm going to do this really quick because I've maybe 5 more minutes, and then we'll hand it over to Roundtable. We have 120 permitted BMPs and 65 retrofitted BMPs between 1 and 12 years old in Middle St. Croix. we're tracking that. We have an inspections and maintenance tracking form for all the BMPs that have been installed most of them for the last 10 years, all of them since 2014. And we have digital inspection forms, and we inspect all of the voluntary retrofit BMPs every year and some of the regulated BMPs. We ask a lot of good questions in our inspection data as we're out inspecting them, and then we assign maintenance priorities based on the inspection, and those go from A is it's working, it looks great, kind of that B. BC area it's starting to degrade, needs some work. C is really, it's starting to lose functionality, which is a big priority for us. Obviously, we need all of these working, and then F is that it just isn't working at all. We also have a program that we started in 2016 of assisting communities with maintenance. And so I've got some good information here. This is the rain garden, a curb cut by a retention basin before the maintenance program started, and then after 3 years of maintenance, it's finally kind of come around. And the hard part about maintenance is if you're not doing it annually, the first couple of years are really painful and really expensive. Once you establish an annual stop, it gets really quick and really easy. And that's really the direction that we're heading with our maintenance program with all of these BMPs, is just trying to have consistency with them, with all of our communities. And our maintenance crew consists of 3 to 4 folks with a dump trailer and some hand tools. And just a quick look at the numbers. The 2015 maintenance program was about 3.5 hours per BMP, and these are primarily bioretention basins. And the 2016 inspection was higher at 4.6. In 2017, our numbers are down a lot. We're about 2 hours per rain garden, and we're expecting that to get quicker. And so what we're seeing in our data for 2015, 2016, and 2017 for inspection data is that our A gardens are increasing, so we want that trend to continue. Our B, our partially functioning ones, are decreasing, which is good. But we find these areas that are partially functioning, we can see in the data that they actually weren't getting any better. And so that was kind of the area that we targeted, and then we're not really doing much with the non-functional systems yet because we figured we would prioritize getting these guys under control first. So what was driving this? Really, this was just a lot of vegetation control and mulching management. What's happening with these guys is these were actually rock inlets. So as the water comes off of the curb line or out of the pipe, there's no pre-treatment, really just spills onto rock and goes into the rain garden. Has anybody here ever tried to clean out sediment from a pile of rock? It's incredibly time intensive and painful. It's painful from both a financial and a physical sense. And so what this data really did for us is it had basically prioritized us going through and getting rid of all the rock and sod inlets in our BMPs and retrofitting them with something that would easily shovel out. So this is our solution for now. They're pavers with a solid base that are glued. Not ideal. We put our first one in 3 years ago, and they've stood up. And so this year, the city of Stillwater agreed with us that it was time to actually start implementing this so we could start alleviating some of the pain we're feeling for maintenance. So these are currently going in. So that's one component. I also want to mention that on every BMP that since 2013 that we put in, now we include pretreatment devices. We're using a proprietary device called a Rain Guardian. The primary reason is that they've got a grate on top, they've got a screening, it's a dry sump, and the grates are lightweight and it's shallow. So hand crews, which are the cheapest form of maintenance that you can get, can pop the tops off, hit it with a flat shovel and be out of there. And we're currently running about 6, we can clean out 6 of these an hour when we're on just a run of doing pretreatment clean out versus spending an hour and a half on one rock inlet. So it makes a big difference. The other thing that we're doing for maintenance is we've started an Adopt a Rain Garden program. This year was the pilot year, and we haven't seen a lot of people actually adopting rain gardens to maintain them yet, but we did actually have some great attendance at some volunteer events. So we're going to be focusing on more events. Next year, the biggest and most intense maintenance that occurs on rain gardens is right away in the spring, cleaning out all the accumulated weeds and trash and senesced vegetation and cleaning out the inlets from the winter. That takes a lot of time, and so focusing our volunteer events in the spring makes a big difference on the amount of time that it takes our crews for the year to maintain rain gardens. And this year we were able to maintain, with volunteer crews through that event, we did about 60% of the rain gardens that we were maintaining for the year, so that was a pretty good rate. And there's just a note that you just never know how dirty a watershed is until you actually have to clean out the gross solids. And what's great about these is that this rain guardian is completely full. There's a concrete version and a non-concrete version. It's getting cleaned out. This is obviously a BMP that's in the right place, and it's making a big difference. So we just need to plan for those. All right, and I think with that, I will turn it over to whoever wants to take the floor next.
Just give them a round of applause for heaven's sake. And we don't have much time left, and these folks have to hit the road, but I was wondering if just real quick we could bring them up, Mike, John, and Brad, and do some quick questions for them, because I'm pretty sure you got to have some. And while you're getting up there, I'm going to throw the first one out, because it goes way back to the beginning of this. You guys talked about banning phosphorus, like I said, boom, we banned phosphorus. I'm not sure anybody else in this room thinks that would be very easy to do here. So just kind of wondering a little bit what kind of pushback you got, what kind of challenges you faced with that, sort of the Cliff Notes version of it, because I know there's a lot of other questions in the room.
Oh, sure. That was in the early to late 2000s, so single digits, like I think it was 6, 7, 8. I actually wasn't even in the country at that point, so I can't really speak to. The process that occurred. It was a big push from the watersheds, and it was supported by, I believe, by some of the major municipalities at the time. And I don't recall that it was a short process, but I think it was just a long-term process. And we had the data from the University of Minnesota to show that it was having a big impact. And recreational lakes are a really big deal to a lot of communities in Minnesota. So approaches to improve the quality of those lakes, I think, was the thing that really pushed it over the edge.
I would suffice it to say that we've really gained from you doing that here, because before you couldn't get stores, you'd be like, well, carry phosphorus free for people, and they would just look at you like, we just buy what they tell us. And now most of it is, because there's a demand for it for your Home Depots and Lowe's and all those places. So we have gained at least that, even though we haven't banned it.
Yeah.
Well, and it's responded, as people are responding nationally, and we can't ban phosphorus use. Cities cannot in the state of Iowa. There are a couple cities that tried it probably about 10 years ago. In Iowa Administrative Code, it says you cannot regulate combination of any fertilizers in the state of Iowa. So it was tried 10 years ago, and I was involved in that process.
Yeah. I'm just wondering what you guys did. Yeah. What other questions do we have for them? I've got a million of them, right? What's wrong with people?
Oh, good.
There's two things that I kept noticing about your presentation. You kept talking about monitoring, and you kept talking about data that comes from the university. So I was wondering if you could speak to how important this ongoing monitoring is, and how important this data is that you're getting, research that you're getting, in terms of being a persuasive tool with decision makers and developers and those kinds of folks.
And I'll tag on to that. Who's paying for monitoring?
Yeah.
Yeah. So where to start? So the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is the primary driver for the stormwater monitoring that has historically occurred in Minnesota. They have part of their budget allocation is to solve ongoing pollution issues, or to generate research to help solve those issues. So through contracts, essentially the Pollution Control Agency historically has contracted with the University of Minnesota to do that research, and the university has been driving that. There's a Minnesota Stormwater Research Council that was formed because what was happening is the practitioners didn't feel the research that was coming out of that partnership was really addressing the challenges that we were facing with design and performance for this BMPs on the ground. And so out of that, the watershed districts started funding their own research projects in small amounts. So, $20,000, $30,000 here, there, like tagging research onto performance research and monitoring onto projects. And it was really a big step occurred in 2016 when those watersheds decided to come to the council and pool their funds and go out for joint requests for proposals to do research on a larger scale to address really the needs for the practitioners. When that funding came together and they released that request for proposals in 2017, that really helped with momentum at the legislature. And the next legislative session, the legislature just allocated $1.2 million for stormwater research in urban areas. As a matter of fact, in my email today, that request for proposals just came out. And so now the University of Minnesota is going to be pursuing that. The work that was done on iron enhanced sand filters was done through a grant from the University of Minnesota in combination with some of the funding from the PCA, as well as combination funding from a lot of the watershed districts as well. So it's numerous sources.
So ultimately, where is the money coming from the legislature? Where's that money coming from to do the monitoring? Or the University of Minnesota to do the monitoring? What pool of money?
Yeah. We have what's called the Clean Water Fund. So there was back in 2007 as well. There was a state passed voter amendment to add 1/3 of 1% sales tax to the state that would go to 3 areas: the arts, parks and trails, and water. Arts, parks, trails, and habitat, and water. So out of that fund, essentially, there's about $150 million a year generated for clean water work in Minnesota. Quite a bit of that funding gets divided amongst the state agencies, the Department of Health, Agriculture, the Pollution Control Agency, but we are getting right now, it's about $30 million on the biennium that goes to the Board of Water and Soil Resources that then goes out for requests for proposals for either grants or no-interest loans for doing that work.
What is the population of Minnesota, and what percentage of the income is from tourism?
I was going to ask a similar question. I mean, the focus of your state, your legislature is that they're viewing this water as an attraction, right? I mean, it's a tourism attraction, which is what I'm assuming helps drive their incentive to set sales tax funding aside for these projects.
Yeah, I think it took a lot of years for that amendment to occur. There was a lot of push for a number of years to fund for more funding in all 3 of those categories, and the legislature wasn't responding. And so the amendment was really the vehicle that was they got put in place to demonstrate from all these different groups. I mean, it's an interesting coalition, isn't it? The arts together with parks and trails and wildlife and water quality, but that partnership with that amendment received 60+% in order to get passed. So I don't know what the numbers are. I would say that in the Middle St. Croix, we're on a recreational water body that generates millions of dollars a year in economic revenue for the communities along that lake. And so I know that I don't have to convince the board members from the board members of the Middle St. Croix from the community that water quality is important in the valley. They know that, and so really all of our effort is focused on what are the best approaches to do that.
It's a little different than where haven't really even overcome that first hurdle with the explanation that that water quality is an important issue to the health and well-being of our regions, and also an opportunity for tourism. So.
Yeah, I would say that one of the big big stormwater education tools that's been implemented that we haven't really mentioned in Minnesota is NEMO, non-point education for municipal officials. It's been been established in Minnesota since 2004, 2005, so it's been going for a long time, and it's really focused on presentations to council members and mayors and information and education sessions about stormwater management. Locally, that program, we bring that program in through our education program in Washington County, and they host a workshop on the water every year and have been for 12 years. So we get local elected officials to come on a boat, and then while we have them captive on a boat, there are sessions on ordinances and shorelines and stormwater, and it works great actually. And honestly, local elected officials come back year after year, and it's a good opportunity to get them together with county commissioners and watershed district and watershed management organization board members and some of the state agencies as well. So that's been really effective for us locally. NEMO has made a big impact statewide as well.
And that's done through University of Minnesota Extension, and so that is funded
It
as
is.
well.
Yeah.
Versus we tried to do that here.
I'm sorry, what is NEMO?
Oh, non-point education for municipal officials. And that is the big, like John said, that's the big challenge as municipal elected officials turn over. And so you have to find a way to sustain it.
What other questions do you have? Let me ask just one strategic question then that occurred to me, which is you were talking about this idea of kind of a one-stop shop, it sounded like. Once you got your ordinances passed on a more regional basis, then it sounds like your organization is actually doing some of the stormwater management, maintenance and approvals, et cetera, kind of taking a bit of a load off of the city officials because you got collective on your regional approach to the ordinances and the requirements. And I guess I'm wondering if there's some potential there for that to be a motivator for both the cities and developers by virtue of the ease of that one-stop shop concept to kind of get behind more of a regional approach. Do you have any opinion of that at all, or does anybody have a thought related to that?
Well, I can just say that what we see is a lot less frustration from those wishing to develop or redevelop property. It just takes, even if our regulations are very similar, you still have individuals interpreting regulations and things like that. And, as much as, as a city engineer, it's a little tough to get over the loss of control to a certain extent, because now the WMO is doing a job that we've been doing all those years, and I'd like to think we were doing a pretty good job. But at the same time, we got to remember who our audience or who our customer is, if you want to define it that way, and really the end goal is to try and help. I always feel like it's to try and help people do what they're allowed to do on their property that they want to do. For instance, they can't do everything, they can't do anything, but if we can make that path to approval as smooth as possible. And that's some of the feedback that I get from people is, how it's a lot simpler. Maybe I should say it's less so feedback as it is fewer complaints that we had, years ago when the system was working the other way. We just don't run into the same kind of complaints anymore.
So the before mids, you still all had a lot of requirements. They were just inconsistent. I mean, I'm confused about mids you describe as being kind of a pretty, the lowest, level. So what were you doing before?
So, we would have performance standards around, pond volumes or discharge quantities or quality, quality or quantity, rates or volumes and things like that off a property that were calculated differently. And if you use, Brad can probably speak to this maybe in a little more intelligently than I can, but there's if you're taking a volume approach as opposed to a quality approach, you get different outcomes. And this one is a different method of incorporating the two sort of together. So that, in other words, we'd have somebody come in and work with us to come up with a plan that complies with the city's codes. Send them off to the WMO, and their performance standards are looking for something a little different. So then they'll have to redesign.
Jurisdictions.
Yeah. So they'll redesign then to meet WMO standards. And then because they changed what they designed, they have to come back to the city and say, well, we changed what we designed. We need to check now to see if that still complies with the city's regulation. A worst case scenario where we say it doesn't quite, so let's change this, and are we sending them back to him? That's 4 stops, already in that process. So this has really reduced that down to the 1 stop.
How many stops do we have here locally?
Just going to another
I
project.
don't know, how many permit approvals do our developers have to go through locally? We issue those permits, correct?
I think it might be 1 or 2,
I-
because it's an MS4 city.
Right.
They
When I
have
did
to
the
submit
stream
a
restoration
SWIP,
on
and in the
Smithville, I
SWIP,
went
you have to, you have to include stormwater, post-construction stormwater management. So that's 1, but then there might be development standards as well. So 1 or 2.
I think
Plus they
Clive,
want
Sometimes
us in
they-
multiple jurisdictions.
Yeah,
Clive could
sometimes
speak to this, but I think that you guys have maybe adopted a couple more, or like another layer recently in the last couple of years, but that's maybe the only metro city that I know of that's gone a little bit higher standard than Walnut Creek. Yeah.
That's correct.
And it still depends on what the project is and where it's located, how many different jurisdictions might be involved.
Right, yeah.
And with some of those changes, it's the same process, it's just a different expectation of the design standards. You just have the different methodology, same process.
We don't have as many layers of watersheds. The watersheds don't have authority on the design itself at this point, like Minnesota does. So that's the difference. I mean, Minnesota people call me sometimes, consultants, like, okay, well, what do we need to do to meet your regs? I'm like, we have none.
Yeah.
If you meet the cities, you're good. So that is one difference that we're looking at here, is we don't have those other ones right now.
Our watershed management authorities have an authority.
Yeah. But I wouldn't say it would be impossible to standardize regulations
Right.
across the metro.
Still
And we were
be
talking
adapted.
great that we did that with our fire code
Right.
through the exercises with Council Crossroads. And I know when Clive implemented their updated permitting instructions, I think it was kind of with the intention that others would hopefully follow suit. We haven't gotten there yet.
Big bad Clive, we just call the shots, right? We should be,
They're not bad regulations, we just haven't approved them yet.
But that same complexity that you describe, between different levels would occur across, and you have developers that work everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
And so they definitely have interest in simplifying that.
Well, and projects might actually cross jurisdictions sometimes,
Yes.
and certainly the water flow does. That's definitely happening. Any other final questions or thoughts for our team from Minnesota?
Impressive.
Thank you.
Thank you.